Welcome to Chapter 3, Physical and Cognitive Development in Infancy. In this chapter, we will look at the 5 following topics. Each will have a video. The first is physical growth and development in infancy, which we will cover in this first video. Then we have motor development, sensory and perceptual development, cognitive development, and finally, language development. So let's begin with physical growth and development in infancy. And we will cover the following topics: patterns of growth, height and weight, the brain, sleep, and nutrition. So let's begin with patterns of growth. And we will look at a couple of patterns of growth: the cephalocaudal pattern and the proximal distal pattern. So cephalocaudal basically means, head to tail. Caudal translates from some language to tail, and ceph has something to do with the head. Okay, anyway, so it's basically head to tail or top to bottom. And this just means that, your earliest growth is going to start up top. The head, first of all, because the brain requires the most maturation of any part of us. I mean, it gets an early start. It's been developing for months and months prenatally, and it will continue developing throughout childhood and adolescence, because it's such a complex part of a human. I mean, the most complex. So anyway, so when you see a baby born, I mean, if you look at their proportions, they have huge heads. Their heads are well ahead of any other parts of their body in development. The head actually takes up about half of their total length at birth. I mean, half of the baby is head, if you measure them. And as you go downwards, you'll see that their legs are extremely short, and you'll notice this even with with toddlers and preschoolers, that when you watch them run around, the young children, I mean, like they're on short. You can tell that they kind of have short, stubby little legs. I mean, like because of this pattern, they're developing from top to bottom, and so the head develops, and then the neck, and then the shoulders, and the torso, and the arms are next. And you get down to the legs, and the thighs develop, and then the feet are kind of last in the sequence. And have you ever looked at young children? I mean, and babies. I mean, they have tiny little feet. So that's the top to bottom pattern of growth. And there's also a second pattern, proximal distal pattern, means inwards, outwards. So, the center of the body will develop before the extremities of the body. So your torso and shoulders, and, they will develop before your arms, and your arms will develop before your hands, and your hands before your fingers. And so as we move outwards from the center, this represents, the pattern of growth. And once again, those feet and toes, I mean, they would be last in this sequence as well. They're kind of they're at one of the extremities of the limbs, and so this is, both of these patterns kind of work against the feet. I mean, they're the lowest from top to bottom, and plus they're kind of the furthest away from center. And so this is once again explaining why babies and young children have small feet and little toes. And initially, I mean, because of this proximal distal pattern, you also see, stubby little fingers and small hands. And okay, so this is the typical pattern of growth, patterns of growth. And actually, I forgot that I had this picture. So I was talking about, the length. Actually, at birth, I was wrong. I was actually thinking of this first picture. This is at It's at two. It's at 2 months prenatally. I guess a baby would look weird if it was half their length. But anyways, at 2 months prenatally, the head you can see is taking up half of the whole length. So I was wrong. Excuse me. I apologize. The newborn, the head's only taking up about a quarter of the length. As adults, our heads take up about an eighth of our length. So sorry for that mistake. Yeah, if I had thought about it, baby, yeah, half their length being a head would look awkward. But anyways, you can see that I was actually thinking this 2 months prenatal development and where it's taking up half the length because the head has started so early in development, prenatally. And so you can see as we move along, when we get to adulthood over at the right side, you can see that our legs take up about half of our length, and you see it's a while before we reach that. So with a newborn, their legs are closer to just a quarter to a third of their length. Anyways, so this is kind of showing the pattern of growth. Not all of our parts of our bodies are growing at the same rate. We get that top to down and inwards outwards patterns that help to explain the different growth rates and why your arms will develop before your legs, for instance, because they're higher up. Okay. Let me just go back 1 second. See that first 2 months prenatal picture, that kind of looks like one of my grandfathers, but weird looking head. Okay, let's go on. Height and weight. The average American newborn is 20 inches long, weighs 7.6 pounds. Most of the newborns are between 18 to 22 inches. They're somewhere between 5 to 10 pounds. Anywhere in that range is considered, a very healthy birth. Babies grow about 1 inch per month during the first year. By 2 years of age, they weigh approximately 26 to 32 pounds. So, when they were born, they started between 5 and 10 pounds on average. And by age 2, they're up around 30 pounds. So, I mean, this is tremendous growth. They're basically, more or less tripling or their initial weight at birth within the first 2 years, maybe even like 4 or 5 times, depending on their weight at birth. I mean, but it's a tremendous growth period. We never grow at this rate again. I mean, obviously we have a growth spurt during puberty, but it doesn't match the rate of growth of a newborn. Okay, and you can see by 2 years of age, they're between 32 to 35 inches in height. So their height has increased about 1.5 times. So at this point, at 2 years, they are about 1/5 of an adult weight, an adult's healthy weight. They're about half of an adult's height already at 2 years of age. Growth is episodic. It comes in spurts. It's not constant. If we look year by year, it looks like a continuous, constant pattern because particularly during the elementary school years, what you'll see is that when we get up to that age group, it's basically constant pattern. But throughout development, growth comes in spurts. I mean, babies or toddlers or preschoolers or elementary school children, doesn't matter which age. I mean, they will sometimes go long periods without seemingly putting weight or height on, and then they will shoot up overnight. I mean, there's documented cases of children gaining 3/4 of an inch in one night, which is huge. I mean, like you would think that they'd move up a millimeter at a time, but in one night of growth, I mean, they can shoot up a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch in that one case. So I mean, there are periods of growth and other periods where they kind of stagnate for a while, and this is normal. So when we look day by day, we see that it's not continuous growth. If we look at longer time periods, at least after these initial couple of years, growth would look continuous. Oh, look at this cute little baby here undergoing an EEG assessment. So we have techniques for examining the brains and the function, the the functioning and also the structure of infant brains. And this is one of the methods that we use. EEG stands for electroencephalograph. It records electrical activity in the brain. You get those little wave-like patterns. You've probably seen printouts before, just up and down waves, and it's one of the techniques that can be used with infants. They attach a skull cap, and you can see that it's not invasive. It's not requiring the infant to stay still because they really can't. They move about and whatnot. So you can't use techniques that require the individual to lay still, but you can use techniques like this where you can put some kind of what's called a skull cap with monitors on it, and it allows the baby to still move about while you're recording electrical activity in the brain. So let's look at some brain development, and then I'll talk a little bit more about mapping the brain. But first of all, there is a rapid and extensive growth through infancy and later of the brain. I already mentioned, the brain's the most complex, obviously, human organ, and it's going to take development for 20 years to finally kind of complete its initial development. In the first few years of life, it's tremendous development in the brain, tremendous, and as it says here, extensive, rapid growth. At birth, the brain is about 25% of an adult's brain weight. By 2 years, that brain is now up to 75% of an adult brain weight. So it goes from just being a quarter of what of an adult's brain weighs up to 3/4 or 75%. So there's so much development that goes on in these first couple of years. The brain is very vulnerable to shaken baby syndrome. Most people, I would assume, have heard of that or know what it is, but the brain can easily move about in infancy inside the skull, and if a baby is shaken hard enough, the brain will be shaken inside the skull, and it can bruise and bleed, and it caused extensive damage. Babies have had blood coming out of their eyes after being shaken before because of the damage that was done internally, or in some cases you might get some blood, or even in extreme cases they've even found brain matter coming out of the baby's ears before, because their brain can get damaged. Our brains become more secure in our skulls. I mean, we are always susceptible to this. That's why like football players get concussions, for instance, because the brain gets banged against the back of their skull. And but it's more likely in the younger we are. Our brains do gain some protection, and they do gain a more secure footing, so that I can shake my head about violently, like just moving my neck and nothing's going to happen to my brain, obviously. I mean, like it takes tremendous impact now that I'm an adult in order to damage my brain. But with babies, just shaking them, I mean, and so don't ever, I know you know this, but don't ever shake a baby, and don't let anyone else shake a baby. And it is just serious damage. I mean, you can like just cause irreplaceable and unfixable damage to the brain, and that basically is going to hinder the child for the rest of their life then, any damage that's done. And besides, I guess while I'm here, I should just leave it alone, but do we really have any need to be kind of punishing a baby? I mean, they're not very responsible for their actions, okay? They're not at all, I should say, not at all responsible. I mean, if they are upset or if they are crying or whatnot, I mean, that's on you as a caretaker or a parent. Um, the baby didn't cause their own dilemmas. I mean, they're just, you know, laying around in the world trying to trying to learn how to use their senses and their motor skills, and they're not doing things on purpose to to piss you off or anything. So I mean, parents sometimes can get so mad at their babies, like, you know, like they believe the baby's, you know, scheming, and oh, she's crying on purpose because she just wants to get my attention, and or she's mad at me, so she's crying on purpose. I mean, like, it's, you know, all the evidence suggests that none of that is going on. Okay, if the baby's crying and you've probably done something to upset them, or they're hungry, or they just need change, or they're scared about something because maybe you're yelling at them earlier. I mean, like, there are reasons, external reasons for them to cry and anyways, okay, I should leave it alone. But the incidence of shaken baby syndrome happen during the months when babies cry the most. So it's not surprisingly, it's usually the cause of somebody shaking a baby is that they're trying to get them to stop crying. Really not the best method. Okay, let's go on. Non-invasive tools that measure brain activity. So I already showed you the picture of the EEG, the electroencephalograph. That once again, it measures electrical activity in the brain. And just speaking of electrical activity, remember, all of our neurons produce electrical activity. They're like, the axons are like little wires and that send electrical charges along them. So when your brain's active, you have measurable electrical activity happening. We also study babies' brains with FNRIS, functional near infrared spectroscopy. Excuse me. You'll see I struggle with long words sometimes. I don't know why, but this is somewhat of a newer technique, certainly, than the EEG, the functional near infrared spectroscopy. It's more portable. Babies can explore the world while we examine the brain. Like, they can actually crawl about and whatnot. And once again, it involves like a skull cap, just like in this earlier picture. But it's actually even more portable than the EEG. You don't have to. They can really move about in the environment, and we can be examining the brains while they play and crawl and things like that. It's pretty cool. I don't know all the specifics of it, but I know it's been used a lot to study infants' brains. We okay. I had to pause for a second and let my dogs bark. Let me mention a couple of techniques that we don't use with infants. We don't use PET scans. They can carry a radiation risk for a young infant, developing infant. We don't use MRIs. An MRI or an fMRI, requires you to be still, and babies can't stay still long enough to be scanned with those techniques. So there are certain techniques we can use and others that we can't. Okay, anyways, what have we found out when we examine infant brains and we map them out? First of all, let's talk just about the structure. The forebrain is the portion furthest from the spinal cord. It includes the cerebral cortex and the structures beneath it. The forebrain's like the main part of your brain. When you see a brain and you see the what you're looking at is forebrain, like the massive structure. The other structures are much smaller and lower down. So it is the topmost part of our brain from front to back. The brain has two hemispheres containing four lobes. So two hemispheres, it's split down the center into two halves. The two halves of the brain are often responsible for different types of processes, and we call this lateralization, when there is specialization of function in one hemisphere of the cerebral cortex or the other. We always are using both hemispheres in one way or another, but sometimes we use, we have concentrated activity on one side or the other for certain processes. Uh, First of all, I'll talk about a couple of these things. First of all, real basic is that the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body and receives input from the right side. So the left part of my brain is controlling my right arm right now and my right leg, and also it's receiving input from my right visual field. So if I'm looking straight ahead, everything to the right goes to the left half of my brain. Everything to the left of where I'm looking goes to the right side of my brain. And vice versa. The right hemisphere controls the left side of your body and receives input from it. In typical humans, and this isn't true of every human, but in typical humans, the left hemisphere tends to do more what we call sequential processing. Sequential means like it's like a series of steps. It's like, to arrive at an answer, or to figure something out. And so this would include, and here's a nice little memory aid. Left starts with L. Language starts with L. Most humans have their main language center on the left, in the left hemisphere. And language is a sequential process. You're stringing letters together to make words. You're stringing words together to make sentences. It is a form of sequential processing. You're not just looking at a whole page of information and seeing it as a whole. You're reading it word by word. Logic is the other L word that I wanted to mention. So language, logic, left side. And so because we use it more for logic, if you're doing complex mathematics and things like that, then you're using the left side of your brain. And if you think about mathematics, once again, it's a sequential process. You're doing step by step. Logic is a sequential process. Also, positive emotions. This doesn't really fit necessarily with the sequential part, but we tend to do more processing using the left side of our brain for positive emotions. The right side of the brain does more what we call holistic processing. Holistic is like looking at the whole. I mean, like it's a bunch of little parts that come together to form some kind of whole experience or whole object, and so you're not doing it one step, step by step. Something like music, you might do more sequential processing as you, let's say if you're writing a song, maybe, I don't know, like you're building something up. But if you're experiencing music, you are hearing a whole bunch of different sounds coming together to form a whole experience. You're not like saying, oh, I'm going to listen to the trombone now I'll listen to the violin, now I'll listen to the drums, now I'll listen to the guitar, and then oh, and let me see if I can put them together. I mean, like, you experience it kind of as a whole. I'm not saying you can't listen to individual instruments, but your main experience is as a whole. So music definitely fits with holistic processing. So does art. So any kind of artistic endeavors. A painting is about a whole bunch of little dabs of paint to form a whole experience. Like you stand and you look at the whole picture at the end after it's been formed. They say even things like putting furniture together. I mean, apparently we use the right side because we're creating a whole from little parts. Architects tend to use the right side of their brain a little bit more because they're building up a whole building, like a whole experience in a sense. So I mean, I don't. Some of these distinctions are a little bit simplified because, it's not like people are only using the right side when they listen to music or do something artistic or put furniture together or something like. I mean, like both sides throughout the day, you're constantly using both sides of the brain. They're communicating. The hemispheres communicate with each other, pass information back and forth. It's just that we do a little bit more concentrated, holistic processing in the right side, more concentrated sequential processing in the left side. As far as emotions, the right side, I already mentioned the left side does positive emotions. The right side is a little bit more active for negative emotions. And that's all. Those are the only things I would really want to concentrate on. I mean, you could read about other claims about what the left versus right side does, but those are kind of some of the main things. And it's not, once again, it doesn't apply to every human. Some people, their brains are just ended up forming a little bit differently. I mean, about 10% of the population have language centers on the right side of in the right hemisphere of the brain, for instance. Okay, and there's actually another 10% use both halves equally for language. So about 80% it's left, 10% right, 10% both. So I mean, these generalizations don't apply to every brain. Let's take a look at a picture here. I mentioned that the brain has 4 lobes. So besides being split in 2 and having 2 hemispheres, each hemisphere has 4 distinct sections, which we call lobes. You can see them pictured here. I'm just going to basically mention one important thing in each lobe, I guess, that I want you to know. So the frontal lobes, and know what's written here, what they're responsible for. So frontal lobes are involved in voluntary movement, thinking, personality, and intentionality or purpose. So thinking, it's about, personality, intentionality, purpose. I mean, these are big things. The frontal lobe is really kind of your control center of the whole brain. And it's really kind of where you are, like, in a sense. It's kind of, your personality is mainly there. Your thinking is there. Your decision-making, problem-solving mainly originates from there. And so it's really kind of the most defining lobe for being human. And I mean, I'm not saying the other lobes aren't important, but okay. I said I'd mention one area. I'm going to mention 2 areas in the frontal lobe. One is the prefrontal cortex, and the very front of your brain. That is really the part that is, when I mentioned the control center, it's the prefrontal cortex. The very front of the brain is where it's kind of like where our consciousness is. The part of you right now that's just making decisions. Maybe you want to go have a sandwich. I mean, like, that's coming from your prefrontal cortex. You're deciding something. You're solving problems with that part. You're using it for impulse control. Okay. And the second part I want to mention is the motor cortex. It's at the very back of the frontal lobe, right where it meets the parietal lobe. There's a strip, and actually you can kind of see the strip. Like the last, part of the frontal lobe, there's a strip that's running across your brain, and that's where your motor cortex is. That's where you initiate all of your voluntary movements. Going back, we have I guess I'll go in the order they have them written. We have the occipital lobe at the very back of the brain. Vision is all you have to really know about that. It's where our visual cortex is. And that's where we process all of our visual information and make sense of it. So that's where perception of vision happens. Most people think they're seeing with their eyes, but your eyes have no idea what you're seeing. Your eyes are just an instrument to get the outside world converted into electrical impulses, basically brain activity. And once the brain activity travels back from your eyes to your visual cortex, that's when you recognize what you're looking at. That's when that's where perception happens. Your eyes are just involved in sensation, meaning to pull energy or physical stimuli from the outside world into the brain. So the eyes convert light waves into electrical impulses. Vision takes place in your visual cortex at the back of your brain. Okay, temporal lobes, you can see they're on the sides. They have an active role in hearing, language processing, and memory. So I want you, mainly think about the easiest thing is to remember it's right near your ears. So it's very important for hearing, and language as well is happening there. And you can think about language, well, that's where you listen to language. And so you can kind of remember that it's hearing and language. So where our hearing, our auditory inputs are processed in what's called the auditory cortex. Not surprisingly. So we have the visual cortex for our vision. We have the auditory cortex where we process sound waves. Or actually, your ears process sound waves. We're processing what those sound waves mean. The cortices actually are processing electrical activity from the neurons. Okay, so I keep, I've mentioned a couple times already. So, each of our senses, there's there are what's called sensory receptors. I know I'm going off track a little bit here, but we have sensory receptors. Your eyes are a sensory receptor. They receive light waves. Your ears are a sensory receptor. They receive sound waves. And the sensory receptors then translate everything into brain language, electrical impulses. Those are processed in what's called cortices. So we had our visual cortex, we have our auditory cortex. The last one I'm going to mention is in the parietal lobe. It plays an important role in registering spatial location, attention, and motor control. In the parietal lobe, we have something called the somatosensory cortex. It's right behind where I told you the motor cortex was. So right where the parietal lobe meets the frontal lobe, there's a band that runs across your brain. It doesn't really look like a band picture here, but there's a band running across the brain that contains the somatosensory cortex. That's where we receive all of our touch information. Things like if somebody touches your arm or a fly lands on you, I mean, that gets registered there. If every like movement of your limbs and whatnot, it gets registered there because it has external as well as internal detectors. So like when I bend my leg to, like as I'm taking a step, like there's certain I'm getting certain reports from my knee because my knee is bending. It's telling me, hey, this knee is bending. Okay, and every feeling from the outside world, every touch sensation is recorded there, including things like heat and cold and pressure on your skin. Okay, that's the somatosensory cortex. Okay, there are others. I don't care about the gustatory cortex is where we perceive taste, and we have an olfactory cortex where we perceive smells. So okay, let's go on. But know these four areas and those specific brain parts I mentioned: motor cortex, visual cortex, auditory cortex, somatosensory cortex, as well as the prefrontal cortex. Boom. All right. So all this happens inside the brain due to neurons. So, I mean, all these parts, these cortices are responding to neural impulses. They're not, so remember, they're not responding to visual stimuli like light. They're not responding to sound. I mean, in a sense, you could say they are because we're acting on what we've received from the outside world. But remember, that's the job of the sensory receptors. They put everything into brain language. And then the cortices, use brain language, which is basically neurons firing, electrical impulses, neurons firing and communicating to one another. That's what a thought is. That's what a visual perception is. That's how I know what my wife's just said to me. I mean, like it's because I'm processing a bunch of billions and billions of neurons that are kind of flashing on and off in a sense. They're having electrical impulses and communicating to one another, sending charges along their axons. So let's talk about the neuron, because it is the building block of our brain and the building block of our whole nervous system. It's a specialized cell. It has some certain parts that other cells do not have. And so let's go through these. We'll start with the dendrites. This is something that only neurons have. Because they're communication cells, meaning that they communicate with one another, the dendrites are used or have the specialized purpose of receiving information from other neurons. And so incoming information comes in through those dendrites at the top. You can see a couple of arrows coming in. Not only do they receive information from other neurons, but they'll receive information from muscles and from glands as well through these dendrites. So then we have the cell body there. Everyone, that's not special. Every one of your cells has a cell body. It contains a nucleus, which has your genetic code in it. It'll contain your 46 chromosomes, and so all of your genetic information that you inherited from your parents, just like every other cell, is going to have a copy of your genetic code. So every cell carries a copy, so it knows what it's supposed to be doing, because your genes are basically instructions to tell cells how to function. Okay, if this neuron here receives enough incoming information through its dendrites, it will want to pass on the message. You know, it's like, oh, a whole bunch of other neurons are sending me excitatory signals. I better send this message on, this excitation message. So the charge kind of builds up in the bottom part of the nucleus. So like all the incoming information is kind of summed. So if it gets enough of it, it will send a charge along this long axon, an electrical impulse. So the axon, you know, it's lengthy, and this is a specialized parts of neurons. No other types of cells have axons, and it can be very lengthy at times. We have one axon that runs from your big toe all the way up your leg to your spinal cord. I mean, one single long axon. Anyways, so this allows, the axon allows a neuron to communicate with other neurons. And when I say other neurons, I mean, each neuron is receiving information from thousands of other neurons, and each neuron sends its information to thousands of others. So it's not like there's a chain of one neuron communicates with the next neuron, and, you know, it's like a web of neurons, okay? So each neuron is connected to, you know, thousands of others. Anyway, so if it's excited, it sends a charge along its axon. And let me just, the axon's purpose is to transmit information away from the cell body. When the charge reaches the end of the axon, it causes the release of neurotransmitters from these terminal buttons that you can see at the bottom. So the terminal buttons release neurotransmitters. You know what neurotransmitters are: dopamine, serotonin, GABA, norepinephrine, etc. Probably the ones that people have heard about the most are dopamine and serotonin. Anyways, when it releases neurotransmitters from these terminal buttons, then other neurons will receive the neurotransmitter molecules on little receptor sites that are on their dendrites. So, you know, if we put another one of these pictures right below this one, then the neurotransmitters get released from the terminal buttons, and they attach to little receptors on other neurons' dendrites. And that's how one neuron communicates to another. It's a chemical process. So within the neuron, it's an electrical process. Whenever this neuron communicates to others, once again, it sends an electrical charge along the axon. And the electrical charge is the same, you know, it's not just called the electrical charge. I mean, it's the electrical charge. It's like sending a charge along a wire, you know, when you plug something in. I mean, it's the same, exactly the same principles at work. So it's an actual electrical charge. And so within a neuron, it uses electrical activity. In between neurons, it uses a chemical process. The neurotransmitters are the message. Okay. The last thing I guess I'll mention here is or maybe two things. Okay. One is that this axon may or may not contain a myelin sheath. This is a fatty substance, and it coats the axon. And it's exactly the same principle of why we cover our wires. So all the wires in your home, you know, none of the wires in your home are bare wires, hopefully. Okay, sorry, I had to pause again. My dogs get antsy whenever one of us is away from the house. They're so used to having us around, and they were expecting my wife home from work anytime, and she just came home. So like they were freaking out when they heard her at the door. Anyways, so let me continue. I was talking about the myelin sheath, I believe. And I was mentioning, yeah, all of our wires, like we don't have bare wires in our home. They're all covered with whatever, plastic or rubbery, substance, whatever it goes around wires. I don't know, but it insulates the wires, right? It makes it so that the charge isn't going to escape the wire. It's going to run straight and true, and it actually speeds up transmission of the charge. And it's exactly the same with the myelin sheath. That's just a covering for the electrical impulse that's going to run along the axon, and so it will speed up transmission of messages. And what we find is that axons that get used more, neurons that get used more, will tend to have myelinated axons. The most important neurons in your brain will all be myelinated, so that you can have very fast processing. There's occasionally some neurons that may not get used as much, or and they may have unmyelinated axons. It also, the amount of myelin will also vary. The thicker the myelin coating, the faster the axon can transmit information. So that is what a myelin sheath is. Okay, and the last thing I want to mention before I leave the diagram is I told you that the terminal buttons release neurotransmitters in order to communicate to other neurons, and it eventually settles on receptor sites in the dendrites. There's a little gap in between the terminal button and where it is going to communicate with the dendrite of another neuron. That little gap is called a synapse. It's not written here on this diagram. Synapse just means tiny gap. It translates to basically tiny gap. So these terminal buttons don't actually touch the dendrites of other neurons. They come basically as close as you can without touching. There's a tiny, tiny sliver of a gap, and that gap is there in order for, there has to be a space for the neurotransmitters molecules to travel into and therefore hit the receptor sites and affect the receiving neuron. Okay, let me go on. So some changes in neurons during the first years of life. Okay, I already mentioned myelination, or actually I didn't say that actual term. Myelination, it means the process of myelinating an axon, building a myelin sheath. So it's encasing axons with fat cells. Once again, this increases speed and efficiency within neurons. Increased connectivity among neurons creates new neural pathways. We call this process synaptogenesis, the formation of new synapses. Synaptogenesis, and one long word. And so that's increasing connections between neurons. So a connection is wherever there's a synapse, we call that a connection, even though they're not technically touching, but we call it a connection because that's where communication happens. So one thing that's happening certainly early in, throughout development, but especially early in life, is your brain is forming a lot of new connections. It's undergoing this rapid synaptogenesis, and the neurons are becoming more and more interconnected. Okay. Let me go on. Changes in regions of the brain. Blooming and pruning vary by brain region. So let me explain these terms real quick. Blooming is just, it's really the same thing, I guess, as synaptogenesis. Blooming is that new connections are being formed. So it's a different word that, because I don't know if your book uses synaptogenesis, but it basically means the same thing. So blooming is like the neurons are becoming more interconnected, and it's also, blooming is also applied to when new neurons are being formed as well. Pruning is something that starts happening, it really kind of starts happening in mid-childhood or so. What happens is we tend to get a lot of synaptogenesis and blooming going on in the early years of development, where the brain builds up more and more connections among the neurons. And in fact, it's going to become much more interconnected. There's going to be more connections than adults have. So it's going to build more connections than are needed for an adult brain. So it overproduces connections within the brain. And then what happens is, based on experience and experiences in life and environmental input, these connections get assigned to different things. So a child learns what a dog is, and there's a pathway to support that new knowledge, for instance. And a child learns to walk, and there's pathways that support that physical skill and remembering how to do it. And child learns language, and there needs to be pathways for that. So the brain overproduces pathways and connections within the brain to support any kind of new learning. It's kind of like a generalized device that it's like whatever kind of learning goes on or whatever kind of experiences you have, there are pathways that are going to kind of register these experiences, and you're going to the pathways are going to support all of the learning you can do. And then around the age of 6 or 7 or so, pruning really starts to happen, and because that's around 6 or 7 is around when the brain's at its maximum connectivity. At no other point in life will you have as many connections in the brain. Some of them start to disappear. That's what pruning is. It's trimming. It's getting rid of the connections that aren't being used. This is going to help speed up processing in the brain. It's just exactly the same ways. If you've got a plant and you want to grow, one of the best things to do is to kind of get rid of some of the branches or some of the leaves or some of the that aren't growing as well. So you prune it down, and the other what's left will thrive even more. So the branches that you leave are going to grow more because there isn't extra energy being wasted in these little smaller branches or whatnot that weren't doing very well anyways. And so we prune our tomato plants. We get rid of some of the extra leaves and little branches and stuff, so that there'll be more energy put into the main part of the plant and the tomatoes. And anyway, so same thing with the brain. Pruning starts, and pruning is going to continue. Certainly throughout the rest of childhood and into adolescence, and the brain will eventually reach kind of the adult number of connections, and it will be much more efficient and faster because of the pruning. Okay, so they vary. This process varies by brain regions. I don't know, this is just one example. I'm not going to get into it. There's a peak of synaptic overproduction early in life in the visual cortex, followed by a gradual retraction. So the overproduction is the blooming, the gradual retraction is the pruning. Heredity and environment influence the timing and course of development. Let me give you one example of another system. Your prefrontal cortex, I talked about that earlier. That front part of your brain that that does most of the most important work of your brain, I would say. It reaches peak synaptic density already after 3 years of age. So I mentioned that overall your whole brain, it's around 6 or 7 that it reaches its peak of connections. Your prefrontal cortex develops so quickly and overproduces so early in life, it's at its maximum connectivity just after the age of 3. The adult levels, and then pruning starts happening, and the adult level is not reached until late adolescence. So the pruning goes on from the time just after 3 and all the way up until late adolescence, and in order to shape the final product. So it's a long a long time of development. The prefrontal cortex it's the latest, or it's the last developing part of your brain. And it is considered the most complex part of your brain. And I said that the pruning, will go on until late adolescence. So it's still not, that part of the brain still isn't done until your 20s, because myelination actually continues into your early 20s of your prefrontal cortex. So some of you may not even be done with your brains if you're still in your early 20s or late teens. I mean, you would still have myelination going on in your prefrontal cortex. The pace of myelination does vary. I'll give you another example. Your visual pathways, they complete their myelination in the first 6 months of life. So the prefrontal cortex is taken into your 20s. The visual pathway, it's done myelination in 6 months. Auditory myelination, it's not completed until 4 or 5 years of age. So there's great disparity. I mean, your visual pathways are myelinated in 6 months. Your auditory pathways not until 4 or 5 years of age. Different brain regions develop at different rates, and they myelinate at different rates. Okay, I think that's enough for this. Let's go on here. Early experience in the brain, and we're going to talk about something very important here about the brain. First of all, let's just go through what these examples listed here. Children in deprived environments, such as a Romanian orphanage, may have depressed brain activity, and this was certainly shown to be true. They're picking on Romanian orphanages because they generally had very overcrowded and poor conditions. The little story behind it, I guess I'll just mention it. I mean, I don't remember the exact years, but at some point, Romania outlawed contraceptives. So you could no longer use birth control or any kind of contraceptive devices. And so they just had an explosion of babies. And so it was pretty poor thought out policy. And a lot of these babies weren't wanted. And so all of a sudden they had like factory sized orphanages to house all these unwanted babies. And so, babies would be crowded into cribs, like a number of them at a time. And they didn't have a very good ratio of caretakers to look after these orphan babies. And so these babies would spend most of their days just sitting in a crib and not really being cared for, not really having experiences in the world. And as a result, what we found was that if they spent enough time in these poor orphanages, even if then they were adopted into, well-to-do families, and because there were a lot of adoptions that took place out of these orphanages. So if they had spent, like, let's say a year or more in one of these orphanages, we found that the damage was permanent. Even though they went to very good and rich environments and loving parents, this initial damage was permanent. It couldn't be overcome. And what they started finding is that these babies wouldn't respond normally. Like, once they were in a good family, they didn't attach normally to their caregivers. They had like emotional and behavioral problems throughout childhood. And we really learned from that and from other studies that the brain is responding to your environment. And so if you start off in a crappy environment for the first year of your life, your brain is damaged. It does not develop normally. And this was a very important lesson. And they did find, if it was, I think, I don't see, once again, I don't have the details in front of me for that, sorry, but I think it was like, if it was less than 6 months and they were adopted, they tended to be fine. But so there's a kind of a link that if it's not like just any damage for a short period will cause lasting damage, but if you spend a significant enough time growing up in very poor conditions, then you will have permanent developmental damage in your brain. Okay. So the brain demonstrates both flexibility and resilience. We call this plasticity, meaning that your brain can restructure itself. Your brain is It's not a set. Um, it's not like your brain is not set in stone, just based on your genetics. Your brain is constantly responding to the environment and responding to conditions, and it's trying to adapt. It's always trying to adapt, and so this this plasticity is an incredibly important idea. The the children in the Romanian orphanage, I mean, their brains adapted in a negative way. They had very little input. They weren't having experiences in life. They weren't being exposed to a variety of sounds or a variety of sights. They were like looking at apparently they were growing up in very drab surroundings, so they weren't seeing like what a normal baby would, lots of colors and different objects and things like that. They had such limited input that their brains responded with not developing normally. I mean, the brains responded to the environment, and the environment was bad in that case. So the response, plasticity, can be both negative or positive. If a child or if a baby or a child that grows up in a very rich environment with lots of environmental input, he goes on trips to the zoo and he hears different forms of music all the time, and his parents talk to him him or her a lot, and he gets interesting toys to play with, and it's just a whole variety of experiences and inputs. Then that is a brain that's going to respond very positively, and it's going to it's going to kind of give that child its best chance at growing to their potential, developing to their potential. Here's one case of extreme plasticity, and it's Michael Rabine, pictured here. His right hemisphere and other areas of his brain had to reorganize to take over his language functions and process speech after his left hemisphere was removed due to uncontrollable seizures. So he had major operations at the age of 7, and then again at 10 years of age. And you can see, like, it's kind of smallish picture, but if you look at the picture of the two skulls there, I mean, over on the right side, you can see that dark area in the right picture on the left side of the brain. And that's all the part of the brain missing. You can see it's almost half the brain. It's not the whole left side, but it's most of it. And remember, language is typically processed in the left side of the brain. The other brain scan, the one on the left, this is showing Michael processing language before the operation. You can see that little blue area. This showed that he indeed had left hemisphere processing for language skills, because that was the part lighting up when he was doing a language task. This is some time after his operation. The right picture, you can see that once again he's performing the same type of language task, and you can see that there's a lot of right side activity. So he was able to regain language skills because his brain reorganized. There was basically no right side processing when he was doing the language task before the operation. Now his language center was on the left side. You can see it's a little bit more expansive. It's not going to be as efficient as his original language center, because there's had to be this whole reorganization. But so there's a little bit more activity, but he actually regained the ability to use and understand language, and it was a form of extreme plasticity. The brain adapted. All of a sudden, half of it was missing. It adapted and it shifted connections around and functions, and it built a new language center. And this is what brains do. Brains respond to the environment. Brain responds to any kind of environment conditions. In this case, the environment was half the brain all of a sudden being cut out. So plasticity. I guess before I go on, let me just say a little bit more about it. I mean, plasticity is the idea that our brains are constantly changing in response to environmental conditions and inputs, constantly changing. And we didn't understand this for a lot of our history. Well, let me go to the next slide as I talk about this. I'm going to give you kind of our old view, and I'll continue with plasticity. Our old viewpoint, and it wasn't that long ago, scientists thought that our genes primarily determine how our brains are wired. And this isn't written here, by the way, but yeah, our genes determine how our brains are wired, and the cells in the brain responsible for processing information, they just develop on their own. So whatever brain your genes produce, provided or produced for you, you were essentially stuck with it. And so the old viewpoint was that you're born with a certain brain, and that's your brain, and it doesn't really matter how you grow up or what the environment is. I mean, like, you have a certain set brain based on your genetics. And there are still a lot of people, by the way, that believe that, okay? And I don't know if probably none of you, because you're educated, but there are a lot of people that basically think, well, I was born not good at math, so I'll never be good at math. My brain just doesn't do that well. And that's kind of what we call a fixed I'm trying to think of the actual term that they use, but it's a fixed processing view. Okay, fixed, I don't know. Anyways, it's a fixed view, okay? And meaning that, your brain is set in stone, and it operates a certain way. And it's called a mindset, okay? It just came to me. That's called a fixed mindset. And the actual truth is, a much better mindset is called a growth mindset. It's an understanding that your brain continues to change and respond to the environment. And this is what we've learned. This is what plasticity is. That whatever experiences we have, it changes our brain. And so let me get back to what I wanted to say about the importance of this. I mean, when you are either parenting or caretaking or looking after a child, I mean, like, everything you do, and particularly the first few years of life, plasticity is at its maximum. Whatever you do with that child, every experience that they have is affecting the ultimate outcome of the structure of their brain. Okay, when you take that child to the zoo, they form new pathways in the brain. When you read to that child, they form new pathways in the brain. And you talk to them a lot, they form new pathways. And if you hit them or spank them, this is also causing changes in their brain. Okay? And they may grow up, for instance, to be mistrustful of others because they were spanked a lot during their infancy. So the idea that parents have had at times that, oh, it doesn't really matter what I do with my 1 or 2 year old, because they're never going to remember it. I mean, this idea is so far from the truth. It doesn't matter if they ever consciously remember anything. I mean, I don't remember anything from the first few years of life, but what I know now is that all the experiences I did have, help to determine the ultimate connections in my brain. So these early years of life are extremely important. And I say early years, I don't want to overemphasize. I mean, all the years of development are important. The brain can still change in your late childhood and in your teens, but plasticity is greater the younger we are. The brain is more flexible. It responds more dramatically to environmental inputs. So we can really damage a child with early experiences, no matter, it doesn't matter if they remember them or not. And we can really enhance a child's opportunity to develop and maximize their potential by giving them all the environmental inputs and that will support their brain development. And this is the importance of plasticity. If you read about plasticity online, for instance, you'll see a lot of times it's referred to like with the Michael Rabin case, about repairing damage. And that's certainly an important part of plasticity. But plasticity is happening every day. Every time you learn something, every new experience you have, it's a little plasticity going on. Your brain is changing in response to it. So I'll just before I go on to the neuroconstructivist view, I'll give you one example. I was just thinking about from my life. Well, if I had to come up with an example of brain plasticity, I would reach back to my adolescence. I mean, because once again, it's still going on then. And I played chess throughout my adolescence. It was the thing I did the most. It was the most important thing to me. And hours and hours and hours every week playing chess. I mean, Um, so many hours. Okay. I spent a lot more hours playing chess than I ever did like on schoolwork or things like that. And when I think about now and doing that from the age of 10 up until I really started to get away from it once I got to university. But so throughout my teenage years, I mean, I think about what did that do for my brain, and most people kind of look at it like, well, you had a certain brain, and so that made you good at chess. But the way to look at it from a plasticity standpoint is playing all of those hours of chess really changed my brain in certain ways. And when I think about my skills now, I mean, like, I can be a meticulous, planner, for instance, and which is, you think about the skills of playing, a 4 or a 6 hour game of chess, and and staring at it intently for all those hours, and like you plan every move out, you do it all in your head, and I think it made me a very good researcher and very good cognitive psychologist, because I was known for being very meticulous in designing well-crafted experiments, because you have to think about every possibility, like what are all the possible variables that are going to affect the results and things like that. Experiments are a good experiment is actually hard to design. Like I said, you have to kind of craft it in a sense, and people with very meticulous minds that can imagine impossible outcomes, and I think when I think about chess, I mean, that's all you're doing all the time. When you play chess, most of the time you're just staring at the piece. The actual movement of playing chess is a little bit every now and then you move a piece, but then you, in between moves, I mean, sometimes I'd spend half hour, 45 minutes on one move in a game of chess, because it'd be a very important position, and you're staring at it for that length of time, just going through over and over like all the possibilities, and so I know my brain changed because I played chess, and that's plasticity at work. And so this is why I'm probably so logical now, and meticulous, and in mentally meticulous. In other ways, I'm a slob. In other ways, but I'm mentally meticulous. Okay, anyways, let's go on. So think about, for you, what kind of experiences did you have that changed your brain, and maybe caused you to think differently, or to change your behaviors or your skill levels or things like that. There are lots of possible examples you should be able to come up with. So I told you the old viewpoint was that our brains were set in stone. They were caused by genetics. The neuroconstructivist viewpoint is the newer viewpoint. And so, it basically, first of all, starts with these first 2 points are very similar. Interactions between experience and gene expression in the brain's development are important. So experience is environment, gene expression, is your biology, your genetics. The second point is biological processes and environmental conditions influence the brain's development. So both biology and environment. So in both these first two, they're talking about nature and nurture. And it's stressing that nature and nurture are determining the development of the brain. It's not like the old viewpoint where it was all nature. Yeah, it was all your genes. No, nurture, environment, adapting, experiences. These are determining how your brain ends up. Okay, the brain has plasticity and is context dependent. So the environment, context dependent, just means the environment's going to influence the brain's development. If you grew up in a poor orphanage, or you grow up, let's say, living in poverty, these types of environments, these types of contexts, I want to say context, these contexts are going to have a negative influence on the brain's development. If you grow up in better circumstances with lots of environmental inputs, like I was talking about earlier, it will have a positive impact. So the environment influences the brain's development. And finally, the development of the brain and the child's cognitive development are closely linked. So this is just saying that how your brain physically develops, which is what happens whenever there's plasticity, your brain is physically changing. This determines how you think, which is cognition. So the development of the brain physically is going to affect how you think. And, we know that that's obviously true, that connection. So you put all this together, and it's just pointing out this idea of plasticity, that our brains are not determined when we're born. Our brains continue to evolve and change. And so going back to my important point again, every moment you spend with a child, I mean, you are affecting the development of the brain in one way or another, in small little bits every day. I mean, but if actions are repeated over and over, if a child, let's say, is physically abused, throughout childhood or something like that, I mean, the series of events is going to have a long-term and often permanent effect. Even spanking a child can negatively influence the brain's development. Okay, so just to finish the slide, these factors listed here combine to either advance or constrain the construction eventually of how this person thinks, their cognitive skills. So they either advance with a positive influence or they constrain it with a negative influence. Let's go on. I'm okay. Here we go. Sleep. Okay, let's whole new topic then. Sleep. This one I'm going to go through a little quicker. There's an evolutionary perspective that sleep is necessary for survival, and you may say, well, of course, we have to sleep to survive. But the way this perspective is that this sleep, we developed sleep perhaps because we needed to hide and stay still during nights for our survival. Back in, if we go back far enough, before there was any kind of lights and before we discovered fire, and I mean, like, darkness was humans' enemy. I mean, you could walk off a cliff. I mean, like, you could be attacked by from some night animal, and like, we were not good at night. Humans were not good at night. We needed to hide away, just like lots of animals do. There are lots of animals that hide away during the night, and there's others that flourish at night because they have special skills for operating at night, and we don't have those special skills. So this argument just says that we learned to sleep because we had to stay very still, and we couldn't move around because we couldn't see, and so eventually this became sleep, just staying still for whenever it was dark. This is not, this is a hypothetical argument. We don't know if at one time maybe we didn't sleep at one time, or or maybe we slept less, or anyways. But that's one argument. We do know that sleep replenishes and rebuilds the brain and body. It does have a restorative function. It helps to clear out waste in neural tissue. Okay, it seems to replenish us. Let's just go on. It's critical for brain plasticity. So just to connect back to what we were just talking about, it's been shown that you get an increased synaptic connections between neurons when you sleep. And this fits with lots of research findings showing that learning is enhanced when you have a good sleep following the learning. And it's because your brain takes that time to form some of these new connections for plasticity to work. It forms new connections, and that consolidates your new learning, your new knowledge. Typical newborns, they sleep approximately 16 to 17 hours per day. The range is anywhere from 10 to 21 hours per day. Infant sleep-related problems affect 15 to 25% of infants, which includes nighttime wakings. This is often linked to separation distress or anxiety if they can't sleep through the night. There are cultural variations that influence infant sleeping patterns. So, for instance, with the Kipsigis in Kenya, the infants sleep with their mothers, and they certainly do that in other cultures as well, and it's even become more popular in the U.S. to do some form of shared bed sleeping. My daughter, when she was an infant, did sleep with us. or actually infant and child. Actually, she's 14 now and she still does most nights. Okay, anyways. Um, and okay, so there are different cultural variations about sleep behaviors and norms. Hey, REM. Let's talk about REM sleep. That's when your REM stands for rapid eye movement. Your eyes move rapidly under your closed lids. You can see it if you look at somebody sleeping. And if they are in the REM cycle, you can see the eyeball moving very quickly back and forth underneath the eyelid. Kind of grosses me out a little bit to see it, but because it looks weird. Anyways, half of an infant's sleep is REM sleep. This is very atypical. I mean, this will be the most highest percentage of REM sleep that a person ever experiences is during their infancy, right after birth. And then for a typical adult, we'll get down to about maybe approximately 20% of our sleep might be REM sleep. So when you're first born, it starts at 50%. Well, what we know about REM sleep is that it helps to promote new learning. I mean, REM sleep is really important for the process of brain plasticity and forming new pathways and so for an infant, everything is new. And this is kind of how the theory goes, why they spend so much time in REM sleep, is that everything is new. They have so much new information to process and to try to, respond to in their brain, to respond to all the new environmental inputs. I mean, everything is new. So they have to, the idea goes that they have to spend more time in REM sleep to process all the new information they're undergoing. A couple more things. One thing that's weird is that they begin the sleep cycle in REM sleep. You might have learned about sleep in 101. I'm guessing we cycle through, four of the stages, before we ever get to REM sleep, and so it comes somewhat later. When babies fall asleep, they start dreaming right away. At least newborns start dreaming right away. By 3 months of age, though, this 50% of REM sleep has decreased already to 40%. And they no longer begin their sleep cycle with REM. So it already changes after a few months. So that's just in the first 3 months of life, they begin with REM sleep. It's up to 50%, but by 3 months, it's down to 40%. And once again, this makes some sense. I mean, they eventually going to decline to about 20%, like I said. And so they already in the first few months, they'll establish some permanent pathways in their brain, because they're going to have some standard inputs, the colors that they look at on their walls every day, and any kind of music that they're hearing over and over. I mean, like, there's going to be certain learning that's already kind of accomplished, and so the REM sleep starts to decline. Okay, let's go on. So this is just showing what I just talked about. You can see all the REM sleep for the newborn on the very left side. And you can see it's about half of their total sleep. And you can see the declines as we age. So by 20 years old, you're spending approximately 2 hours of your night in REM sleep. So for a typical 8-hour sleep, that would be about 25%. When you get a little bit older into adulthood, it will decrease to that 20% mark I mentioned. Okay, I don't need to stay there. Sleep and cognitive development. So I've already talked about some of this. Sleep may be positively linked to cognitive development. Likely occurs because of sleep's role in brain maturation and memory consolidation. So I already mentioned that we're consolidating new information. That's what memory consolidation is referring to. And this point here, you could make the note, particularly REM sleep. It's sleep in general, but they find that this memory consolidation happens more in REM sleep. Better memory, language, and executive function, following sleep, and lower quality sleep is linked with distractibility and behavioral problems, so some abnormal developmental issues with low quality sleep in infancy. Okay, sleep could be linked to sudden infant death syndrome. This refers to, if you don't know what SIDS is, the infant suddenly dies without an apparent cause. They stop breathing and die. So I'm taking a sip of my tea here, or coffee actually. The SIDS rate is about 1 in 2,000 in the U.S. 1 every 2,000 babies, approximately. This is the highest cause of death between the 1-month-old mark and the 1-year mark. We'll look at some more findings here. SIDS is more likely in infants if they have, if any of these conditions exist. So if they have an abnormal brain stem functioning involving the neurotransmitter serotonin, I'm not going to add to that. If they have a heart arrhythmia, SIDS is more likely. If they have sleep apnea or low birth weight, the babies that do not use a pacifier when they go to sleep. So pacifiers have been shown to reduce the rate of SIDS. Any baby whose sibling has, if they have a sibling who's died of SIDS, it makes it more likely that they will. So that's it means that there must be something common between them, whether it's genetics or environmental similarities. Those that are in lower socioeconomic groups, it's a higher rate of SIDS death. That's mainly going to be environmental conditions. In poor homes often aren't ideal. For instance, babies that are exposed to cigarette smoke, or particularly if the mother smokes, they're more likely to die of SIDS. And so this kind of links to the previous point. Lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to smoke in their home, even with babies or children. Babies who share the same bed with parents or sleep on soft bedding are more likely to experience SIDS. Babies that sleep on their stomach, just to add to this list, or their side rather than their back, are more likely to die of SIDS. We want them on their backs. Hence the term back to sleep program, which began in 1992 by the American Academy of Pediatrics, started the back to sleep program. This is, was based on our research findings that you reduce the rate of SIDS by putting babies on their backs. Babies that have too many covers or blankets or pillows are more likely to die of SIDS. Or if they're wearing too hot of bedtime clothing. Sometimes we try to overcompensate for the fact that they're babies and they're small, and we think, oh, we got to keep them warm, and we put like big fluffy PJs on them, and sometimes we might crank the heat up in the room to make sure we keep them warm. Rule of thumb, people, is that if you're comfortable in that environment, the baby's going to be fine too. So don't make it more than what you would sleep in. Like, don't make it warmer than what you would do, or put extra clothes on the baby that you wouldn't wear. They're no more vulnerable to the cold than you are as an adult. So this is one of the mistakes, and it increases the likelihood of SIDS. The warmer the room is, what you want is you can reduce the incidence with the ceiling fan. Like, you want to move the air around, but also you want to keep it at a reasonably cool level. A baby doesn't need a lot of extra blankets, doesn't need a lot of extra covering. So these are the good things to make sure you do. Okay, SIDS is less common if they are breastfed. For whatever reason, that's a protection against SIDS. If they sleep in a bedroom with a fan, I mentioned that. If they sleep, I mentioned the sleep on backs, in the Back to Sleep program I already mentioned. Okay, so and there are some ethnic differences. African American and Eskimo infants are 4 to 6 times as likely as others to die of SIDS. Nutrition. Nutritional needs and eating behavior. Infants should consume approximately 50 calories per day for each pound they weigh. As motor skills improve, infants' eating changes from using suck and swallow to chew and swallow movements. As they can eat semi-solid and then complex foods. Okay, so yeah, as they're moving from mother's milk or bottled milk to semi-solid and complex foods, they have to change their eating behavior. Babies need to have a varied diet. You should introduce fruits and vegetables early. And early meaning for the first 6 months, you just want them on milk, hopefully breast milk, or if not, then formula. But ideally, breast milk for the first 6 months alone, and then you start to introduce some fruits and vegetables and other things that are good for them, during the second half of the first year after 6 months, while continuing to breastfeed or bottle feed the baby. So these things get introduced gradually. So early meaning it still means after 6 months. They don't need anything but breast milk for the first half year. Unfortunately, there was a study done of 3,000 randomly selected 4 to 24 month olds. So they were between 4 months and 24 months, 2 years. And they looked at their eating habits. So, as it says here, the most common vegetable fed to the 15-month-olds were French fries. You don't need French fries at a year and 3 months of age. And I've had parents in a classroom before say, well, it wouldn't be fair to them to not share. We get McDonald's, and it wouldn't be fair to not share with the baby. And it would be more fair to not share than to start them on this bad habit of giving them French fries when they really don't need it. And, okay. Try not to give junk candy and French fries and other junk to babies or toddlers. From the study, 1/3 of them, of the 3,000 infants and toddlers studied, ate no vegetables. 1/3 of them. Fruits and vegetables are what you want to get them started on. Then these same parents that aren't feeding their infants and toddlers are going to complain when their children later stick their nose up at vegetables. Well, where do you think they will develop the appetite to eat vegetables later? You need to start early in the first year of life. Almost half of the 7 to 8 month olds, 7 to 8 months of age, were fed desserts, sweets, and sweet drinks. Once again, they need nothing else to drink except breast milk or formula. You don't need to be giving them sweet drinks. You don't have to give them candies. They don't need desserts. Okay, and I get that everyone loves having a little baby around, and it's funny watching them, eat little things that they're give them a lot of pleasure, and sure they'll like it. And who doesn't like sugar? But it's just try to give your child the best start life. Let me go back to the idea of brain plasticity. Those sweets you're giving the baby, their brain is forming. They're going to start forming pathways like, I love this sugar stuff. And those pathways get formed, and no wonder this person is going to grow up and then overeat sweets, because you were giving it to them when their brain was forming. Give them good stuff, take into account brain plasticity, and everything you do with them, you're helping to form their brain for how it's going to work throughout the rest of their childhood and adolescence, and actually throughout the rest of their lives. So get them started on good habits. Okay, I don't mean to be preachy, but I know I am. Okay, just a few more slides in this first video. I know it's a long one. Breast versus bottle feeding. While there's not really any competition. Breastfeeding is certainly better for the baby's health. With all of our scientific technology and medical technology, and we're great at making products and drugs and things. I mean, like, we cannot replicate the benefits of breast milk. And you would say, well, we should be able to reproduce the chemicals and whatnot. The thing is that breast milk is individualized. My mother's breast milk was the best breast milk for me personally because I came from her genes. So when they produce a formula that they sell to everyone, it's not individualized. Okay, so this is why they can't replicate your own mother's breast milk. Is that it's specifically geared for you, her child. And just okay. So breastfeeding is definitely better. The benefits of breastfeeding and outcomes for the child. I'm just going to read through it. Fewer gastrointestinal infections, so stomach problems. Fewer respiratory tract infections. Protects against wheezing in babies, but may or may not be linked to preventing asthma. That's debatable. Okay. Fewer ear, throat, and sinus infections. Reduced infant hospitalizations for various infections. Not linked, but it's not linked to reduced risk of developing allergies. Okay, so anyways, what we see is that it's healthy for them. You can see it's the benefits have to do with all these potential infections and problems and hospitalizations. I mean, like, you're keeping them healthy. Once again, what are we passing through breast milk? Antibiotics. So the mother passes her antibiotics to the child. This helps develop the infant's immune system, and once again, those antibodies are going to be genetically suitable for this particular infant that came from the mother. Okay. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends the following. I already started to talk about this. They recommend exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, followed by continued breastfeeding as complementary foods, such as fruits and vegetables, are introduced, and further breastfeeding for as long as mutually desired by the mother and the child. They push for the idea of at least 12 months in total. So, after you start introducing new foods, you want to at least make it to that first year mark to give your infant an ideal start. And there's nothing wrong with breastfeeding them up till the age of 2 or even 3. I mean, I know there's some people that think it's very weird in this country to see a walking child breastfeeding, but it's very common in certain other cultures, and it's still very healthy for them. So, I mean, we don't do it much in our country because we're a richer country, but I mean, in poorer countries, it's very, very commonplace because it's a source of free food for the developing child, and it's still good for them, whether they're 2 or 3 or an infant. I mean, okay, let's go on. 2 more slides, people. Infant is less likely to develop middle ear infection. This is still benefits of breastfeeding. I forgot that there was more to the list. They're less likely to become overweight or obese in childhood, adolescence, or adulthood. They're less likely to develop type 1 diabetes in childhood or type 2 in adulthood. They're less likely to suffer from SIDS. So the list continued from this earlier slide of all the benefits. The mom benefits as well, as you can see at the bottom here. Lower incidence of breast cancer and ovarian cancer for mothers who have breastfed. Reduced rate of type 2 diabetes. Those findings for the breast cancer and ovarian cancer, consistent evidence for those. It's not like a one-time study or anything. I mean, there's been, because they replicated those studies because and just showed that this is a solid finding that you have less chance of cancer later if you breastfed your babies. When should the mother not breastfeed? These are not surprising. If she has HIV or other infectious diseases, of course, you can pass that on. So you make sure you do not breastfeed. If she has active tuberculosis, this can also cause harm to the infant, or if she's taking any drug that can be passed through her milk. And most drugs are passable. So you have to be very careful what medications you're on while breastfeeding. or and make sure you aren't taking like illegal drugs or things like that while breastfeeding. I mean, as careful as mothers are sometimes during their prenatal months, sometimes they really let loose after the baby's born. But if they're breastfeeding, you have to still be as careful as you were prenatally, because they're still going to get the substances, and they're not, once again, just because they're born, they're still developing just like they were prenatally. The brains are still developing, as we've talked about. So you don't want to be passing illegal substances onto the child. It doesn't mean the mother can never do anything. You have to plan ahead. If you're gonna go party one night, you save up a bunch of milk and so that you give your body time to respond after you've been drinking or whatever you're doing, and you go some, I don't know how long it has to be, but you go a day or a series of days without breastfeeding. Okay, let's go on. Additional issues: breastfeeding can be physically difficult for mothers. Yeah, that's true. Not all studies imply causality between health benefits and breastfeeding. Most studies are correlational. We talked about correlational research in chapter 1. Remember, we can't say that one thing causes another. We just find that certain things are related. Evidence of psychological differences between breastfed and bottle-fed infants is inconclusive. Okay, and that will wrap up the first video in the first section of chapter 3.